technology stack, talking about data integrity. Um, Sitting in this one, and a lot of great conversations, a lot of interesting things. I like the kind of methodology of cutting out the BS of data integrity, and sometimes we get really distracted by some of those things. So go ahead, Travis.
Yeah, I'm going to do my best to keep this one short and sweet and be a teaser because I think it was a great conversation Liz and Amanda led us through. So basically the key points are people are error prone. We should cut them out and only use AI and machine learning. So that's it right there. That's all I have to say.
Done.
I mean, in all seriousness, there was a lot of talk about AI, natural language processing, structured and unstructured data, and kind of what strategies can we put in place to fish those turds out of our data ponds and set guardrails around the data that we think is important and really want to dig into. You know, we all kind of hate this chart. We know where we rank. That's part of why Liz is here. She kind of comes with a different perspective from a different industry. But after our conversations, I think we all kind of have similar pains. I do also have a background in a different industry, and I can tell you that, you know, sadly, one thing that you learn in tech is you kind of see behind the curtain and you realize everybody's pretty screwed up.
Is that supposed to be comforting?
Yeah, it's supposed to be comforting. You're not as bad as you think you are when you kind of get out there and
Well, misery loves company.
Right. Sure. Right. So what are the root causes here? Obviously, one of the main goals for the CPC is to start to develop some standards. So there's definitely a lack of standards there, lack of enforcement. Who's driving that loss? You know, we always talk about the single source of truth, or is it redundant? You know, and then what data actually matters and the assumption of innocence. So kind of planning on this, you know, with the group that we have here, I don't think we're going to have any shortage of opinions. So we're going to kind of let it be a free for all. Liz, if you kind of want to take off and start sharing some of your initial thoughts, and I'm pretty sure that will spur some conversation and questions from there.
When we were talking yesterday and discussing, I was chatting with everybody about, you know, how do we avoid data messiness before going into really large projects? Completely, but from making the same mistakes over and over and over again, what we and my team has found when we approach new clients, I just hold really firm to our belief that we can't just go into a project in order to please a client because they're paying us a lot of money. We have to identify the known issues that will potentially come up and review data that is being handed to us so that we can anticipate the barriers that we will run into if these aren't addressed, right? So, for example, we work with a lot of technology partners that in a perfect world will speak to each other. And in order to do that, we have to set standards for our data. So whether that be naming conventions or setting up the APIs appropriately, you know, little things like that turn into big issues. But before we ever launch, we go through all the troubleshooting and all of the QA to ensure that if we launch A, will it speak to B, and will it spit out what we expect in scenario C? Sometimes those conversations are really, really difficult to have with our. But we have to say, but we will not do that, because if we launch it tomorrow, things are messy, and all the data starting tomorrow until the end of time will not be consistent. They will be broken, and they will prevent us from telling the story that we need to tell, and will prevent us from gaining the insights that we need in order to inform future projects. It really takes a lot to make that happen, right? And in order to do that, you know, what I will say is that instead of just receiving data and trusting that it works, I truly believe that every project, no matter who is paying who and where the budget is going or coming from, that you have to act as like an integrated team and a family almost, right? Because if my data doesn't speak with your data, then it doesn't matter where the money's coming or going. It's not going to work as well as we all hope it does.
Was when I was listening to you, I was chuckling because yeah, we don't. I know from my standpoint in the construction side, we do our testing and whatever while we're vetting a system, but I don't know if we think about it in the total roadmap very well. We don't look at the big picture view. The structured data keeps popping up on my head, and I think that I would imagine I'll ask the rest of the people here, and Amanda, I'll probably pass it off to you too because you're very heavy in this, but I feel like construction deals with an awful lot of unstructured data, and I think that's one of the pain points where you're starting to see like Procore and the other companies really kind of digging into the machine learning and AI and OCR and all those fancy TLAs that Nathan likes to use to kind of handle that. And then on top of that, you have that unstructured data. You don't have the clean process. And then you talked about trust. I mean, that was something that we talked about yesterday is it's hard to see a graph repeatedly and then trust the data behind it.
So, relate it back to what I look at every day is simple naming conventions and how those can really make or break the data that you are working with. And I know Amanda has a lot of thoughts on this too, because I mentioned manual data entry yesterday and her eyes started burning and shaking, and I'm sure. But let's just use an example. Travis, what is a term that in construction gets used a lot, or what's like a piece of data that would get pushed through one system or another?
I think one of our favorite ones is the RFI, right? That's just a structure or a piece of data that contains several pieces of data, but RFI is the total document, right?
Yeah. So let's let me try to make an example out of this. So if RFI was a data point that was being pushed through from one system to another, and I forgot who said it, but some people said that they use maybe 40 plus different pieces of technology on a project. Let's just call it that, right? If RFI was named RFI capitalization in one, RFI lowercase in another, RFI with spaces in between, and you get the gist. We know as humans that that's the same thing. But if you have this massive data set where all those different iterations of the same term are being pushed through, the data cannot recognize that that is the same thing. So what's ultimately going to happen is that it might report on 3 different RFIs. This is probably not the best term for this use case, but 3 different RFIs. Your data points will plot out 3 different trending charts, learnings over time. And in order to kind of fix that, it requires manual, retroactive, human error possibly of data consolidation, right? So very, very small differences that make huge impacts, not just on business intelligent outcomes, but it requires a lot of resourcing and a lot of back of the mail room shit work that nobody wants to do. And that's just a very, very small example of something so simple that could have been identified upfront, but that causes headache continuously moving forward. So I think that might be one example of don't trust your data until you prove it innocent, right? Which is what we talked about yesterday. And it's also an example of kind of pre-planning and implementing strategies and consistencies across all data points before moving forward with projects, and really setting those standards and QA and troubleshooting before you get into those problems.
I know Amanda wants to jump all over the manual entry, and then I got thinking about the errors.
Yeah, so I was just saying everything you said, Liz. Yes. One of the biggest things with any system is you have your front end and your back end, and that front end is what you're saying of data entry point. So I think a lot of things, some of the solutions that a lot of softwares could incorporate are those data validation checks. If you had to enter in a time and you put alpha character should come back as wrong, correct this for a numeric character. But then you go into the back end, like you said, well, let's just say if you were allowed to enter in RFI, capital RFI, lowercase, it's having that post processing of like trimming it all or running queries to put it all together in format, and then you could check it. And those are some of the big pain points we have that causes terrible data issues. And our huge thing too is duplicate records of not catching something that already exists, putting in step logics that say, hey, is this something you've already inputted, and not having that. But it all comes across to integrations. Like for us, some of our large contractors have over 50 different softwares in their companies, one for accounting, 10 for field, and hardly any of them talk to each other, which is crazy to me. It almost reminds me of early 2016 IoT when everyone had their own app and no company would integrate with each other. And now they're at that point of mergers and also talking with each other. So I almost feel like our industry needs to get to that point, but slowly but surely. Does anyone else have any of those pain points?
I guess I'd pop in there from the Procore side. If anyone doesn't know, Procore is a web-based construction management tool. RFIs are one of the big things we do, along with a lot of other stuff, similar to the CoCentral folks on the phone here. We got a few Procore clients on the phone, which is pretty cool. We have our marketplace where we are really trying hard to encourage every company to just have an open API and to allow anyone to build between us, where it makes sense. Companies themselves actually building the integrations to connect key things, which we've done with a few partners and lots of people have done with us. Sorry, my phone there. The thought that I was thinking about on integrations and like going back to the RFI. The RFI is an interesting one. I've been digging into RFIs a lot lately. So with Procore and Liz is kind of to what you were saying too about when you start a new project, you got to make sure you got everything set up right. I feel like in construction, both for the construction companies on the line as well as companies like Procore and tech companies, we are never really like starting a new project with our data. We have 15 years of existing data that's screwing us up that we can't seem to get past. And like what you were saying there, Amanda, with dates, like now in Procore, if you try to enter a date that's not really a date, we'll give you an error. But 6 years ago, we didn't. So if you try to run a query in the whole database, it fails. And then we got data scientists getting all flustered on, all this data from 10 years ago that's screwing things up. And you got to do a lot of smart filters and things to try to get to a cohort of data that works. And I guess there's a million things I could say in this meeting. But I'd say that two key things, just to put them out there, are that concept of if you're trying to do some kind of analysis, at least, of how do you get to a cohort of data that you think is decent. So like we're trying to do some financial analysis right now. And for that, I'm limiting it to specifically companies that have an accounting integration with Procore with a particular feature turned on that I feel super confident that their costs are good. And while that's a tiny subset of all of our clients, it's still a big enough subset to do analysis on and to draw a trend that I could apply somewhere else. So I think that like getting that cohort of companies or data that is good to do analysis is a big point. And then when it comes to machine learning, there's a lot of cool stuff that I think we can do there that can help eliminate some of this human entry problems. Like a massive problem for us when we're trying to build benchmarks across the industry or try to do predictive models is we want to look at similar project types. So if you're building a hospital, I'm comparing to other hospitals. But even within that, like there's a project type pick list in Procore, but it's company definable. So it might say healthcare. Is that, the office of a healthcare facility? Is it a lab renovation? Is it a new hospital? That granularity is not there. So we're looking at things like, can we use natural language processing on the project description from the spec book, combined with 10 things we can extract from the drawings to build our own cohorts of projects and just get away from whatever people input. So those are two random things in my mind right now on really how you get those right cohorts and how you can use things like machine learning to help develop them.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned, Josh, about having a data set that you feel really confident in and comfortable about. That's one, that's certainly one topic that tends to come up a lot in conversations where we know that there's going to be historically messy data. Sometimes we have clients and we adopt old marketing teams that never clean up their data. So we're inheriting just a lot of God knows what, right? But after doing some digging and cleaning, we can say safely, we believe that this set of data has enough integrity that the trend line can inform decisions, which I think is great. On the flip side of that, if you aren't inheriting really bad data, and if you have the opportunity to start fresh, or at least say, as of January 1st, 2021, we know that our data is clean, or, you know, you set kind of like a start and end date. Another exercise that I'll take my team through is, in a perfect world, what does the end result look like? High level, big, pretty picture. And then we start to dissect that and pick apart all the layers and pieces to figure out what exactly do we need in order to get to that point, right? So if the end result and the end report looks like X, what are all of the different pieces that need to take place in order to allow us to report and analyze that? Which then we'll start turning, oh, we can't just have, you know, this, we need our data to be able to be separated by these 50 different pieces. So that's another really strong exercise. And I think it's very like industry agnostic, right? Like, what is the end goal and what do we need to achieve that goal, versus here's our starting point and let's just iterate as we go and hope that the end result is something that we like, right? So
I think that's a pretty good point. I'm sorry to step on you, but I was going to say, I think that's a pretty good point, and it harkens back to some of the stuff Josh said too. I think that some of us in construction, like, we've been collecting data for what, eons now, it seems like, and it's all that unstructured. It's all very, very dirty. But if you take that mindset, and it's a mindset I had when I was on the software side, you know, begin with the end in mind, you start to kind of figure out exactly, to Josh, your point, figure out which cohorts, which pieces of data are really important to you. You don't have to go back and through and clean up everything back to 1967 or whatever it is. You can slice out those segments of data that are important to you, clean up that so you get the reports that you want, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, just hearing the word trend a lot too. Like, for instance, at NECA, we're getting an entirely new association management software, which is always fun. Because one of the biggest things before you get a new software is you never put bad data in, because you only get bad data out. So we're having a huge scrubbing feature going on. But when we're looking at some of our duplicate data, the big thing to try to find is, like you said, look at the end in mind, is how are we getting some of these duplicate records? Like, what is happening that's going wrong, and finding those trends. And we're finding out we have 118 read, write, and append permissions that are allowed. So of course that's going to create havoc. So we're looking at how to implement logic and how to prevent some of those duplicate records coming in.
Liz, I had a question for you on the sort of nomenclature that's used to actually set up your data from the outset. So I'm sure everyone in this room will agree with me here, but you know, the language that's used to describe pretty pretty standard processes, whether it's field processes or RFI processes, they're very similar across all construction businesses, but quite often there's really different naming conventions that go with it. And so what do you think, what's your approach when you're working with clients who, you know, they're the experts in their own processes, but you're sort of trying to give them the right advice to say, in order to get better outputs so that you can actually, you know, continuously improve your processes through insights, how can we help you set it up right from the outset? And then, you know, Amanda, you were touching on this integration piece. If we can get better consistency in nomenclature across everything, then we can start having better data across different platforms that are talking to the same processes as well.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, you know, I think there's, see, I'm trying to use a term that people might be familiar with. Well, everybody maybe nod your head, thumbs up, doesn't matter. Google Analytics. Yeah. Yes. Okay, cool. Google Analytics, and then everybody knows what LinkedIn is, right? And everybody knows what Google Ads is. So to drive website visitation for a lot of our clients, we have to be able to, well, we spend lots and lots of dollars for our clients, and they want to know how those dollars are trickling down into business results, sales leads, right, for their pipeline. In order to do that, we have to basically tag and track all of the media associated with those dollars. But in order to do that, Georgia, we have to have the same naming convention, right? So that all of the traffic and the website leads from LinkedIn and all of the traffic from Google and really any other marketing platform that we use, when all that traffic is driven into Google Analytics, it's all very consistent. So that if we pull a report that shows, I want to see all traffic by source, the only sources that are going to come in are LinkedIn, Google, and whatever other channel we use, right? And then if we pull by campaign name, that's all very consistent. So to answer your question, how do we set those standards? As the marketing firm that is managing all of the dollars and who is responsible for the reporting, we tend to have a conversation with the client up front that says, hey, we know that we will have to append data or append trackable URLs to everything that we put into market. This is our standard naming convention and the way that we would build all of these for everything that we do. Client, is that okay with you? Or do we need to adjust for how your team has been reporting on these historically? Oftentimes they will say, yes, however, we need to change kind of like the position of this field and this field so that, you know, they're all very, very consistent, which is fine by us. We can certainly do that. But that's how we start the conversation, saying that, you know, as the experts in tracking and as the team responsible for analytics, this is how we propose that we set up tracking and data for everything across the board. Where do you have issue with this, and where are you okay with this? So then we start to address the pain points and iterate until we get to a point where this standard works well for my team, but it also works well for their team. If that helps, I don't know. I think that maybe answers your question.
No, it does. It sounds like a standard is needed to be developed to help the industry around it.
Yeah, and I think, and I know
because Google has their own standards, right? That they say we recommend you do this to get the best data.
Yeah, for sure, and they do, and I think that's where things get really messy, right? Like even working with 3 separate pieces of technology, I would say the bulk of the work and the hours and the resourcing that go into a project, I would say 80% of it happens before the project ever goes live, which is really unfortunate, and that's a very scary number to tell somebody who has to report back on how effective their marketing dollars worked, right? But if that is what's going to drive success, then we can't break it up front and just hope for the best. So yeah, the majority of the work and the effort that we go into building something happens before it ever goes into market.
And I think I saw you look at the chat. Did you see the question there from Lil? She's asking, you talked about scrubbing data. How do you see AI eliminating or helping this process in the future? And I would probably layer on top of that, based on our conversation that we had with her on the podcast, so natural language processing as well.
Yeah, so this is a fun one because I'm a total nerd with following a lot of like Elon Musk stuff, and like I know he's some like the GTB3, a lot of that cool AI stuff coming out. But in terms of AI and scrubbing, it's the AI part would be the trends of it literally learning the same things over and over again. Because as humans, I don't mean this is a bad thing, but we're riddled with error, which is fine. But usually our errors tend to be the same thing. Sometimes, not every time. But with that, then you can put in algorithms to predict what they're going to do. So if ampersand and are constantly, used multiple times, then you know that you can have a library saying ampersand equals and. It's the same equivalent. So I think with AI, it's all about predicting this through trends of looking at the same mistakes happening all the time. And kind of also to Georgia, your point, like for us, we're on a smaller scale. So it is so important to have standardization to prevent a lot of these bad data inputs, but sometimes you can't. Like a lot of our contractors enter in data into multiple associations or industry partners, but they all enter it slightly different. So for instance, an example is a name was B2B, literally B number 2B, but another system had them as BEE space 2 BEE, and there's no way it ended up together unless I manually matched it. But what I went through is I made a dictionary, basically a library of matches. So I just run that query every time to catch them. But in short, it's all about finding trends to predict what's going to happen.
That's so funny, Amanda. I currently have a library of mismatched terms and a normalized name that is expected to be reported on specifically for that. And there's no way to know that that, you know, one system named it Google, the other one named it Google Inc., and the other one named it Alphabet. So without those grouping and matching and giving it a normalized master name, it spits out 3 different reports when it really should just be one. Yeah.
So I think another concept that's important to keep in mind when you're thinking about AI, especially here, and I wasn't here for the earlier part of the conversation, so hopefully it's not repetitive, but outcome-based initiatives, because that's really what's going to drive an understanding of what you need to be looking for. I think, you know, I've worked with a lot of companies that are looking to implement data structure, but are not sure what they want their end outcomes to be across multiple different departments, because you have a structured data as a company, but the outcomes that your operation departments want are going to be different than the outcomes that your business development team wants. And that's going to be different than what your, you know, analytics, your marketing, there's plenty of different departments. And so if that plan is not put into place, it does make it just exponentially harder to get it right the first time. I don't think anybody, including myself, have ever got it right the first time, but if you begin with your outcomes, especially when AI begins to get involved, you're going to get better results.
Actually, you said you had an example of using AI to scrub your data.
Yeah, so we at Essential, we are more at the pre-construction phase of the projects with construction companies. So the data that we deal with is, like, for example, contact data, the people that you're talking to. And one of the things that we recently did is everybody struggles with keeping people's contact records up to the date. What's their new title? What's their new phone number? You know, if their name changed because they got married, like all of those kind of things around data cleansing around contacts. And you can just imagine trying to do that across the whole company with thousands of people talking to all of them, and how messy that can get. To your point about somebody saying Joseph, another writing Joe, like, you know, it's just all over the place on that. So I'll give you 2 ideas and 2 tidbits that we used very recently. This goes back to Liz, your point around Google, Alphabet, and all of that as well. Understanding a unique way to identify a record would be a really good way to do that. When you think about Google or Alphabet example or Google Inc. example, right? One of the things we did for companies is we used URL as a matching factor for them rather than the name. So doesn't matter you're calling it Google Inc. or Google, if you put their website URL, it'll be www.google.com at the end of the day. So doesn't matter whether you wrote big space deconstruction or big dash deconstruction as the name of the company, end of the day, the web URL is a constant now. So what we did is, instead of matching by the company name, we matched by the company URL. And if the company URL matches, then we know it's the same irrespective of what the name has been put. And we say, do you want to merge these 2 records together, because they're 2 different records there itself. So from a data perspective, instead of just looking at the face value of the name, thinking about the attribute that could be close as it comes to there itself. Obviously, URL can still be tricky, google.co.in or google.com, like you can go down that rabbit hole, but at least it gets you 90-95% there in doing that. Same thing with people and humans, we use email addresses as a way of doing that. It doesn't matter whether you type Joe or Joseph. End of the day, if your email address is the same, then we know it's the same person you're talking about. Very hard. It's going to be unlikely that it's going to be 2, you know, email addresses are the same and they're 2 different people. Like emails are unique. So using those kind of things that computer needs today to identify yourself as unique elements, like website URLs or email URLs, rather than using, you know, names, is a strategy that we adopted and worked very well. So when people enter the data, instead of we asking them to enter their first name and last name, we made them enter the email address first. And as they entered the email address, we said, this email address already exists and here is a person. Instead of having them think about Joe and Joseph from that perspective, right? So that's one thing. And second thing we took one step forward is, when you're in Outlook, you already know people's email addresses. So we actually put inside Outlook a way that we can look up your email address from the email that came to you. So you're not even typing the email, and we are actually using the email address from the email that comes in, which means we're eliminating human errors of typing a wrong email address itself from that perspective. So 2 points I'm making. come up with unique ways to figure out what is that way that you can make it unique. Emails and domains is an example. Second, avoid people entering the data, get it from wherever they are so that you don't even have those kind of mistakes about capitalization and spaces that you can avoid there itself. And the third point I want to make there is about updates on their contact things. Not relying on humans, but using AI. We use AI to scrub email signatures on emails. The best place to find people's updated phone number is actually their email signatures, because people update their email signatures with that itself. So instead of asking humans to enter and update the data, whenever an email comes, we are sitting in Outlook and we say, this person's title, this person's phone number has changed. Do you want to update it? So instead of letting them do that, we would scrub through AI models the whole email and the email signature and get that updated information and prompt them itself. So these are some of the examples that we have used as technology to help people manage their contact and company information there itself. I hope this was helpful examples.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you very much. Darren, before I think you raised your hand. I think you had some thoughts you wanted to share.
Yeah, I guess, one of the things I think the benefits of AI and ML have to do is just, I'm thinking back throughout my history, there's been times where I worked for a really old company once. We actually went through scanning and archiving data of drawings that were over 100 years old. Believe it or not, they were actually referenced quite a bit when you were adding on to some historical buildings. But some of the old timers there, they could look at a drawing and they could tell you who drew it, just by the style. Similar when I've archived, digital content, and, I could tell if a file wasn't named right, and I know who did it, who was on that project, just by the characteristics of the naming. I think, AI and ML have the ability to actually, pick up some of those nuances and look for those trends. Okay, if you look at any particular field and see an error in the data, I don't know what the heck that is. I have no context, but AI and ML will let you, potentially look across multiple data points and build some, infer some context into that data point, and maybe even some uniqueness to the actual individual, who created the data.
No, those are very good points. Excuse me.
But at a point that our data scientists like to tell me, when we're thinking about what we can use machine learning for, as far as cleaning stuff up, and they basically say that, if you as a human think that you could get a set of things from this project in Procore and figure out the grouping, then so could ML and AI with the right training and the right data set. So it might be harder in some cases than others, but that, if a human could be given a set of things and they could figure it out, probably ML could be trained to also predict it.
Yeah, and to add on to that, Josh, going back to my comment and pain point about all of the human work that goes into pre-planning and then all of the manual work that goes into fixing bad data, it probably takes a lot of resources and a lot of budget to set these things up front. But oh my gosh, if you set it up and you spend the time doing it, and then you forecast how much money is saved in the future because you are no longer paying 20 people to do what one system could do, right? And then you can have those same people doing more productive things. Then I think many people would find that it would be worth the investment for sure. But to your point, you have to give it the right inputs and help train the system just as you would somebody new coming in to do that same data cleanup. Yeah.
I think all those points are great. I wanted to build on the point that you were making, Josh, because I think it is really relevant in terms of there are so many tasks that, ML and AI can probably take over. But something that we actually came across in our development journey at Pipe was the fact that, we pretty much fully leveraged ML, AI, NLP, and we used that to build a spec or to build a submittal log. The next thing our clients had asked us to do was, I want you to finalize that log for me. Well, those are two really big different steps, right? AI and ML was a really good solution to get to your base structure of what you needed to understand when it came at pulling requirements out of your specs. However, that next stage of finalization is where there is still at least a gap today in what AI is able to do, because it is a much bigger task to then coordinate that across multiple different trades. So I think as you guys think about where you want to implement AI and ML, you need to take into account the complexity, because it can address a lot of things, but it's not always the right choice. And we had to spend a lot of capital actually helping our clients understand that, hey, AI is good for what we did here, but we can't just use that and then finalize your law, because that's not going to give you the results that you want.
That's a great point.
I would also say, at least I think I'd recommend this, in the software world, we try to be agile, we try to deliver the minimal amount of value, test and iterate quickly and kind of fail fast. And I feel like in like a proper construction company, that mindset might not be there. And it might be kind of more like okay, you need to design this exactly, perfectly, properly from day one, and you better get it right and put a ton of time into it. Whereas, I think that you might actually get to the right answer quicker if you intentionally don't be quite as thorough initially, get a bit out there, start collecting some data, see, test, and keep iterating. So I would just,
I think it's easier to fail fast and hard in software than it is to fail fast and hard in construction. Else you probably won't have a good construction business left.
Yeah, well, I'm not talking about the actual construction on the site. I'm talking about, construction companies building their data warehouse and their data, their dashboards.
I think you're completely
I would
right.
say from the construction end, that's one of the places where we do struggle a lot, because we just want it to work, right? We want it to work, and we want it to work right now. And some of the Liz has pointed out several times that the bulk of the work is done up front. I don't think we really want to do that work. We want a Procore and Autodesk to come in, turn on a system, and away we go. And I think that's part of the reason we end up with all this disjointed data, because in with the proliferation of point solutions out there, obviously that helps as well. But I don't think that we always begin with the end in mind. And I'll keep coming back to that, is we don't always have that big picture of what the ultimate goal is. We just kind of keep bolting stuff on as we go, and then try to deal with the crap afterwards.
I have a question for a lot of people out here. Do you guys think it's worth it to take all these tasks on internally as a, let's say, construction company, versus farming this out to consultant, let's say, who's just going to come and provide you a systems architecture? I'd love to hear just general opinions on that.
I think it depends. I'm not in your industry, but I believe that maybe the sentiment is still true. I think it very much depends on what you are looking for, what your internal team has expertise doing. If you are resourced appropriately to take it on internally, I think those are a number of factors that, if there's a huge project and I, like for instance, there are some data cleanup projects that I will personally take on myself, because I know that I can do it better than anybody else on my team. Not because they aren't smart, but because I have the historical knowledge to do it. But if I know that it's due in a month and I just can't do it, I will spend a little extra time, probably a little extra money, and probably some late hours training somebody else, because I can't afford to do it myself. So I don't know. I think it's a balance. Yeah.
Well, for the EC industry so far, I've noticed, and it really does depend on size. It's a huge one with their budget. But for instance, we have the innovation over the podcast, and I've noticed now quite a few contractors are saying they're actually customizing their own systems. And it's because they've had the interviews with all these software companies, and it does 10 things, but they needed 15. And it's that 5 where they're like, I might as well just spend the money on making a custom setup instead of spending it on 3 different softwares. So I've noticed a few of them have been actually making their own custom setups, which is impressive.
Yeah,
but I find that they need to have a balance. Like, the best insights can be garnered from people who know what they're looking for, but there's also a tinge of manipulation of that data to see something that's not there. If it is just an ops guy who is kind of, looking at data streams just with, no filters or no, really strong insights. I think that, having a data scientist in-house is to people's benefit, but I also think that overhead and a salary of somebody who's going to bring that kind of knowledge to the table is not something most GCs or trade partners I'm finding are willing to spend at this point. But again, I think that they know what they are looking for. The insight from them is really the baseline that we create, and then reverse engineer off of that. But I know that also can lead to manipulation or parceling of data to see stuff that's not actually there.
Amanda, I have a question for you and maybe for the group. So I think it's really cool that companies are building out their own things. I actually have a good friend who's a CEO of a company that works for nonprofits, and she built out her own CRM system because she needed 15 things and the existing ones only did 10. But and I think that's the whole purpose of CPC, right? Is to build cross integrations and seamlessness. And with all the, if these companies are building their own instances, would that then further, well, I guess, wouldn't that then just add to the issue of different systems doing their own thing versus like all working towards the same goal?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I say impressive, it's cool that they're doing it, but like you said, it's at the same time, it's like siloing their own stuff, whereas that's the whole point of standardizing, but you have to do it across the board. But our contractors, they have their own secret sauce, which is great. No one's saying ever take away your secret sauce, what makes you, amazing and doing great things. But when it comes to systems and then kind of, was it raising the tides to help all ships go up? It's all about an industry perspective of, if you were to actually standardize or, at least put in the thoughts as to why the integrations don't work, or what are those 5. A lot of times we'll have these interviews with some software companies and they're kind of silent, just, it's not going to work. But it's that feedback of, but in our industry, or for ECs specifically, we have this is our pain point, this is the issue that you can incorporate. And I know for some of the ones we were on, some of them actually did give that feedback, and they're like, oh, we had no idea that was a thing that EC would need. Mm-hmm. So, and they were actually in the process of integrating it into their system. So I think that whole point of actually communicating what is missing is so important.
And I think one of the questions, I guess I'll throw out to the group, and more from the contracting side, and how much of that software that they're writing really is containing their secret sauce, right? The secret sauce is really your people, right? The people that you're putting the work in place. The software systems, I mean, that's where I want the standardization. I mean, I can push data around inside my company, but that doesn't make me really be a much better contractor, I don't think. I think what the better contractor is having the right teams in the field.
Travis, can I answer Darren's question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to type it out and I was like, oh, what's the point? Darren, I mean, this is like why we can't sleep at night, right? Yeah, I think everybody can agree that I think I probably speak for everybody to say that we're hoping that AI can help solve all the things, but at the end of the day, like Amanda said, like humans will make errors, and there's no solve for that. Like that's what makes us human. And so my approach and my outlook on this is that as thought leaders, as managers, as directors, we wouldn't have our jobs if everybody else did what they were supposed to do, right? Like as leaders, our job is to improve everyone else's productivity, to drive strategy, to drive consistency, and really to push everybody forward in a productive way. So no, I think, yes, we can use AI, ML for so many things, but we still need to push for standards. We need to push for integrity, and we need to reject data that is bad to get it in a better place. I mean, that's, I think bad cop is the role that we have to play a lot of the time. But, that's personally how I feel we need to approach a lot of these things, because otherwise we're just going to continue to experience the same issues that we've always been experiencing.
How do you draw that line between structured and unstructured data? One of the quickest ways to grind a company to a halt is try to make everything structured. There's any extreme is going to be bad. Yeah. It seems to be that's the hard part, is finding that, navigating that fine line between what should be structured, what shouldn't.
Sure. I'm type A, so everything in my life is structured, but nobody else likes to follow that. I actually had a coworker tell me the other day when I was talking in Slack, and I was like, can you please respond to the appropriate Slack thread so I can track progress of this project? And he was like, that's very type A of you. I'm like, I'm so sorry. So sorry to ask you to do that. But you know, I prioritize. So I project plan and I prioritize, and I look at the biggest fires. And you know, I delegate things, I delete things, and then I defer things, right? So I look at what is most important to the business today and how can we solve for that. For things like internal documents that are like nice to have because they're HR processes, yeah, I would like to have a naming convention for everything. But is that like the most important thing? No, definitely not. So I think it requires a meeting of all forces, of all hands on deck, all of the team members and the leaders and decision makers to discuss like what is the most important thing that is causing pains in our industry, and like let's solve for that, and then maybe tackle the other things. But that's personal. So I'm very interested to hear what other people have to say about this.
Yeah, Lil, I actually have a question for you, and maybe not to put you on the spot. I know it's only been a recent transition for you, but you've been on the tech side where we've preached this message a lot, and data standardization, looking at the outcomes as you're building these structures and understanding how to achieve that. Now you're in the belly of the beast, a massive GC, and I'm sure there's a lot of these internal struggles going on. I mean, having that lens of the tech, have you seen maybe some new barriers that we don't see on this side a lot? And I know you just started, so maybe that's.
However,
oh, it's only day 2.
Only day 2.
For some reason in my mind, I thought it was at least like a week or 2. Okay, so
it feels like a week or 2. I will say this though. I will say this. Having, you know, I've lived sort of, you know, I came from, you know, a huge, you know, higher education project. And then I went to work for Bluebeam for 8 years. And so my last 8 years of my life has all been about Bluebeam and just, you know, helping clients implement and just really looking at their tech stack, you know, at some level, but really thinking through how we can facilitate that and make that easy for them. Because their biggest question is, we know Bluebeam can do so much and we're just beginning to scratch the surface. And so that's where I dive in. Now that I'm outside of this Bluebeam bubble and coming into like this, you know, huge GC company, and I actually just reviewed all the tech stuff I need to work on, and I'm just blown away. It honestly just how much is out there. But the one thing I have seen as a constant, I know this is day 2, is really thinking about streamline. And it's you know, even though all of this tech does, and I'm just generalizing, does so many amazing things, the biggest question I'm having that's being asked of me is how do we streamline all of this where it all lives at one point? It's going to need to live somewhere, because the traditional way is just to print stuff out and archive it, and then eventually after so many years you toss it or shred it. But how do you do that in the digital world? How do we take that data where it just makes sense and we're filling in, you know, checking off all the, you know, legal checkpoints, but at the same time, you know, we're thinking through everyone's needs of how they need to push that data once they're done using it. So that's all I have on day 2.
Yeah, and one other thought to piggyback off of that, going back to my comment about, you know, as leaders and thought leaders and managers and whatnot in the space, is that oftentimes I'll have to remind myself that people aren't entering in bad data intentionally. I think oftentimes there's a lot of folks that don't have visibility into all of the other pieces of the puzzle, and so they're just kind of checking the boxes off, and they're producing and they're pushing things out the door. But if you're the person that has visibility into all of the things and all of the pieces of the web, you have a better view into all of the breaking points. So, you know, that and that requires that you have very open streams of communication, that you're the one that's putting the meetings on the calendars, that's educating people on why we need to not do alphanumeric when it's, you know, whatever, right? So I think, you know, that also takes a lot of brain power. to train other people who are giving you the bad data, why we're rejecting the bad data, and why we're pushing for system consistencies. Because if we don't, then nobody will know what you're doing on the other end, and therefore they won't work towards that same goal.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with that. I think, and also it always goes hand in hand with anything data or changing anything data wise in a company across all boards. It's always change management is always right next to it, because it's change, it's a new process, and like you said, the educational piece of no one's attacking anyone. It's just, this is what's going to make things more efficient. This is what's going to streamline our processes. But then taking everyone, the people in the field, people in the office, having them all on board, that change management piece is always going to be important too.
Great. I keep looking over at my slides and I keep getting this one bullet point, and I think it kind of, well, there's two actually. I mean, we keep talking standards, and that's why the CPC exists, is because there are no standards. But I would like a little conversation maybe around why don't we? Why is there no incentive? Is there little incentive? What's really kind of holding it up? And is it from the software side? Is there no incentive for the software people to kind of create an industry standard, or is it from the contractor side that we don't think there's any? We're trying to hold our special sauce back or something like that.
Because it's hard, Travis. That's really hard.
Darn it.
No, I also feel like the word standards is like, nobody hears that word anymore. We think standards and it's like, oh, what do I need to do? What checklist do I need to follow? Or it just seems like a very daunting task from my experience. And, we don't even hear the word standards. We just hear, for me personally, when I hear standards, it's like, that's a big mountain to climb. And there's a lot of people to get on board to be in agreement. What is the standard? And this is anything. This is even deciding how we're going to communicate on a project, or how we're going to even agree on a simple naming convention. I think Darren talked about, the old school way of how people were naming things. And now, we're having to digitize that. And I think that's, standards for me is not just what needs to get followed, but it's also just the change management that comes with it.
I could be wrong about this, but isn't it most other countries that have done this successfully, the government has created a standard?
Oh gosh, no, please no.
And that's what I'm saying. I have no idea. I was on this project I'm working on this initiative we have at Autodesk in Singapore, where the Malaysian government just put out, it's like $1 billion to fund construction projects in all technology for 75% of it, if they followed a certain set of standards. Now, that seems like an effective path. Once again, I don't know if that has been effective in the UK and other places.
Australia has some good standards for MEP, but I just talked to a friend of mine down there yesterday, and it's a different market. It's such a large market here. If you just look at standards in general, something new comes out, and then people start to adopt it. It's not being even used the way it was initially designed. Standards are always the last thing that surfaces, but if you also look at how tech is getting developed, the speed and pace is accelerating. It's almost to the point where things are changing so fast that the standards never have time to get developed.
Two things there. And Peter, I see you talking. I'll hand the ball to you in a second. Two things, Travis, to answer your question before we deviate too far from it, I think that a lot of people don't feel personal responsibility for long-term vision, right? So if they can't connect themselves to the success of long-term, then why keep it top of mind? And that's to nobody's fault, right? Like, I think that's why certain people are in huge leadership positions. Certain people create these massive companies because they're dedicated and feel personal responsibility to the ultimate productivity of a huge project or company. So I think that's one piece of it. And then Darren, to your point, I think sometimes it kind of has to, or who said it? Maybe Satyam, who said it. I think sometimes it has to happen that way. Unfortunately, I'd have a really hard conversation with my team last week, and it got to the point where people just didn't care enough. And so it ultimately came down to, if people can't do this, we're gonna have to start writing people up, which ultimately results in laying people off. Why? Because if we don't do a good job, our clients are going to fire us, and then you're gonna lose your job anyway. So, like, take responsibility, understand why this is so important. Those are my thoughts. Peter, I know you were going to talk, so I'm going to let you talk now.
Well, I just following up on, how do you get this off the ground and get it going, right? And to me, customers are really the ones that drive things. And to come full circle, the government is one of the biggest customers, if not the biggest, okay, that there is. And maybe approaching it, not that the legislation there should do something, but I know there's a lot of interest in various governmental groups. And
For the record, I was not advocating for more government controls. Let's be clear
No,
about
but
that.
I think, though, that your point is there needs to be some driving force. People say, okay, now this does make sense. This is the right time. Let's get on board. No one, I don't see anything better. And, because we've been talking about this for decades, as far as I have been,
Yep.
And I thought before about this. This is the reason I brought it up. That the government just has all these different agencies, but even just pick one of them or a few. And I know we've had some of them involved, with RFIs and so forth. But to me, it seems like getting the government to be the lead, helping them with that and helping them cross different agencies. There's so many different government agencies in themselves, yet they can't even organize it. So maybe being a liaison between these government entities and focus on helping them get behind this could help. And there's also this XBRL thing that they're adopting in various, finance, lots of other things. So, I don't know. I know I don't know what kind of relationship we have with that group. I know we're friendly, but maybe it could be more active, more proactive, and maybe that would develop more comfort in government employees who have no idea who we are and why we're here. And maybe the XBRL would say, okay, yeah, you guys can be the sanctioned, construction. It's construction, it's this group here, something like that could help get the credibility.
I think it's definitely needed.
And I think the overall, just two more points on me. Overall, the RFI is the right document to start with, right? It's something everybody needs. There's a time limit, when the ball drops, costs money. And there's lots of these things, right? So this is an all handwritten, and this is like the quintessential thing. And we've been working on it so long, have not made any progress at all. So I think that is the right place to start. And I'm going to take a second to plug in something I'm promoting now, which is essentially a public domain service that numbers projects. So we can have so no matter what company you are, you can all reference like they do in the grocery store business, where you have a barcode on a product that's allocated by a service that makes sure there's no duplicates. And so every project, every design project and every construction contract could have a number, which is a unique identifier. And then every company could use their own internal numbering system, because they do change the name of the project to incorporate the initials of the customer and that kind of stuff. If you can get away from that, have a unique project identifier, I think we can be off and running here with this. It's just my thought.
I think part of the problem with standards, though, humans are inherently impatient. So our first reaction is to make everybody do everything the same, and that leaves a bad taste in everyone's mouth. But if you look at standards from terms of a framework, you actually get more functional. It's not prescriptive, and it's a lot less rigid.
Well, I got to drop. I will look at the video to get the rest of it.
Thanks, Peter.
Bye, thanks.
I think to your point, Darren, I think that's something that I've even struggled internally. Everybody wants to standardize as long as it's on their standard, right? And we're impatient. We want it our way, and we're going to drive it forward like that.
Just do it this way. When you mention standards, the first thing everybody thinks of is red tape. You're going to slow me down. You're going to force me to do things a certain way. And so when I come into a new organization, I start talking standards. Oh my gosh, it's like deer in the headlights. And I'll implement standards that they don't know I've ever implemented, and I get better results, because sometimes I look at it as a framework. I'm gonna build a good foundation that you won't even see, and that's going to drive standards. I'm going to eliminate your need for the variation, and it actually makes them in a lot of cases more flexible, more functional, but just in a predictive manner. It's hard to do, and it takes longer, but
I was going to say, it sounds difficult, and we talked about lack enforcement and bad data and stuff. So you must implement those in using certain systems that just kind of does that enforcement on its own, that doesn't allow those standards to be broken. It's just naturally adopted as part of the process.
Yeah, some of it's just, anticipating what people need instead of if I give them a menu to pick from, instead of letting them just type something in, it's back to a lean principle of, poke yoke, just a mistake proof. You build quality into that process. Anytime I've seen people not doing what I wanted to, it's either a discipline or a training issue, and you can solve a lot of that by just taking away their need instead of stopping them or forcing them to do something a certain way or slapping them on the wrist. Let's try to eliminate the need for them to do that. Why are they doing it in the first place? Getting to that, 5 whys.
I agree with that. I like that.
That's awesome.
That's
I think
looks
we're
like we're
close
getting
to
kicked
time.
out in 10 seconds, Travis.
All right. See you in the main room.
So, I mean, to me, that's sort of what I would think of as, no one's ever asked me that question. I think it's a really good question, actually. I'm going to think more about that long after this is over.
All right, now we need to know who asked the question and what the question was. Now that we got, what about 53 people in here?
Oh, gosh.